Washington, in February 2016, after decades of lucrative paydays from foreign clients, Paul Manafort found himself at an inflection point. He was starting to give up hope of collecting millions of dollars owed to him by a Russian-aligned Ukrainian political party, and was straining to help his son-in-law salvage bad real estate investments. And he was also itching for one last shot on the American political stage. Over coffee at the Montage Beverly Hills Hotel with an old friend, Thomas J. Barrack Jr., Mr. Manafort pursued an opportunity that he thought could solve his problems, joining Donald J. Trump's presidential campaign. And Mr. Barrack, one of Mr. Trump's closest advisors, agreed to help make that happen. By the end of March, Mr. Manafort was on board, and in May, he was promoted to campaign chairman and chief strategist. Under Mr. Manafort's direction, Mr. Trump secured the nomination, rallied much of the Republican Party establishment behind him and set the strategy that would take him to the White House. But instead of being a crowning achievement, the job that Mr. Manafort thought would turbocharge his consulting business set the stage for his downfall. Although Mr. Manafort was forced out of the Trump campaign less than 3 months before Election Day, his suddenly high profile set off increased scrutiny of his foreign consulting work by congressional and law enforcement investigators. The investigations have left Mr. Manafort, 68, owing millions of dollars to his lawyers, according to people familiar with his defense, and led some friends and business partners to distance themselves from him. And on Monday, the Justice Department's special counsel, Robert S. Mueller III, charged Mr. Manafort and his longtime deputy, Rick Gates, with violating lobbying, tax and banking laws in an effort to hide more than $75 million in income from their work in Ukrainian politics. The charges stem from work performed by Mr. Manafort and Mr. Gates from at least 2006 to 2015 for Russia-aligned Ukrainian politicians and parties, including the one led by the former Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych. He could have kept running campaigns for the Yanukovychs of the world, and nobody would have cared, said Hector T. Hoyos, one of Mr. Manafort's closest friends and business partners. But he took on the Trump campaign because he believed that the country was going down the wrong path, and he wanted to make a difference, Mr. Hoyos said of Mr. Manafort, who is the godfather of Mr. Hoyos's daughter. Had things not gone south, Mr. Hoyos said, it would have been a huge business windfall for Paul. When you're a kingmaker, he said, everyone wants to get close to you. That wasn't the main reason that he got involved and decided to run the campaign, but that was in the back of his mind. Nonetheless, Mr. Manafort is not regretful of joining the Trump campaign, said Mr. Hoyos, who spoke with his friend on Saturday. He is regretful of doing the work he did in Ukraine. Mr. Manafort first made his name in politics as a swashbuckling young Republican operative on the presidential campaigns of Gerald R. Ford and Ronald Reagan. But his work outside of electoral politics is where he really made his mark, and his fortune. He and two young colleagues from Mr. Reagan's campaigns, Charles R. Black Jr. and Roger J. Stone Jr., formed the core of a new breed of consulting and lobbying outfit that parlayed campaign-forged connections into big contracts from American businesses and foreign interests seeking to curry favor with the Reagan administration. In this shadowy world of international political consulting, Mr. Manafort, Mr. Gates and other Americans have earned vast sums working for clients tainted by corruption or authoritarianism or whose interests sometimes do not align with those of the United States, including Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines and Mobutu Sese Seko of the Democratic Republic of Congo. For much of the last decade, Mr. Manafort's work focused on Ukraine. He is credited with resurrecting the career of Mr. Yanukovych, and selling him to the West as a pragmatic leader who could bring the country into the European Union. But Mr. Yanukovych's government crumbled in 2014 when he fled to Russia after his security forces clamped down violently on street protests over his government's corruption and pivot toward Moscow. Even after Mr. Yanukovych fled, Mr. Manafort continued consulting for a Russia-friendly party called Opposition Bloc, which emerged from the ashes of Mr. Yanukovych's government. Around the same time, Mr. Manafort began taking out loans on properties that Monday's indictment alleges were purchased using money laundered through overseas accounts from his Ukraine work. He appears to have used at least some of the money to try to salvage real estate investments spearheaded by his son-in-law Jeffrey Yohai. Paul had used the bulk of his cash to bail out the situation that his son-in-law